Good evening, everyone. My name is Derek Pratt. I'm Director of Education here at the Erie Canal Museum. I want to thank you all for joining us today, as well as to thank the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for supporting our lecture series this year, as well as the New York State Canal Corporation and the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor for supporting our History at the Waylock series, which we are doing two more of these kind of after-hour events. One in July, we will have the Syracuse Orchestra here, and another in August, when we will have Jessica Leffler, who just wrote a recent book on the early envisioning of a canal across Nicaragua that was in the direct aftermath of the opening of the Erie Canal. DeWitt Cliptic gets involved and stuff. So thank you to them for funding this whole series, making this possible. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Erie Canal Museum is itself located on the homelands of the Onondaga Nation, Central Firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and that the Erie Canal is located on the homelands of all members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk, Oneida, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca Nations. We recognize the Erie Canal played a major role in the devastation of their traditional ways of living, negative effects of which still linger to this day. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, we are committed to taking action as best we can to address these wrongs through education and inclusion, including in our efforts like our partnerships with the Onondaga Historical Association and the Scano Great Law of Peace Center, reinterpretation of our exhibits and public programs, offering important first steps in this process. We just booked a really cool event that will be released soon in that regard. So we hope you can join us in these efforts. Now, the Erie Canal has had a transformative impact in a number of ways. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, our mission is to engage the public in the story of the Erie Canal's transformative impacts on peoples and places in the past, present, and future. The motive force behind the Erie Canal for its first 100 years was horses and mules, as is so famously immortalized in the Erie Canal song. However, like many other animals at the time, the treatment of these creatures was woefully overlooked. And as we will see, the development of the concept of animal rights is just one of the many transformations the Erie Canal had a role in. But before we get started, I'd like to highlight that this lecture is one of our 2026 Sloan Lecture Series, and we have some really great ones planned for the rest of the year. In addition to this one, I highly recommend signing up for or renewing an annual pass, since you won't want to miss any of our speakers. And if you sign up, you'll be automatically registered for the entire 2026 series, including past recordings. Those will get emailed to you soon. Our next talk is on June 18th, featuring our own Steph Adams, who will be discussing what art can tell us about the history and present state of the canal. You won't want to miss it. I encourage you to check out our upcoming schedule of walking tours, which will be held every Friday and Saturday at 10:30 a.m., starting in June and running through August. We'll be offering a variety of walks on topics ranging from abolition to women's rights and even fire on the canal. But now, on to today's main event. Dr. Ernest Bergh is Professor Emeritus in the University of Tennessee History Department. This talk is based on Bergh's 2020 book, A Traitor to His Species, that tells the story of a remarkable man who helped shape our modern relationship with animals. It's one of many books he has authored. I highly recommend checking out all of them. But we better get going here since I've wasted a lot of time. So, all right, further ado, Ernest Bergh.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary.
All right.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming and out there in Zoom land. My research over the years, I've tried to focus on the stories that I think speak to the present, but go back to sort of origin stories of where our values, the way we think about things, comes from. So in my most recent book, I was interested in the ideas that we've inherited about the human-animal relationship. And particularly, I think, time and again, I go back to the 19th century, particularly the later decades of the 19th century, the post-Civil War period, as a good place to start to sort of recreate why we struggle with the kind of things we're struggling with today. Now, let's see if this moves. Oh, hey, you're wow.
Some did way.
So if we look back at images of the 19th century American city, we see that humans and animals are intertwined in a way that they had been down through history. I took a wonderful walk around Syracuse today, enjoyed these amazing buildings. I think I maybe saw one or two pigeons, but otherwise no animals. But of course, as Derek suggested, horses and mules provided the essential power that built this city and others. In those same cities, you would see pigs rooting in the gutters as sort of a sanitation device, roaming packs of stray dogs, milk cows in back alleys. Often immigrants from rural areas would bring their cows with them, and also cattle and sheep in the streets on their way to slaughterhouses that were common in the poor parts of town in many cities. So all that changed profoundly in the next 50 years after the Civil War. Today, our cities, as I suggested, are mostly sanitized of animals. Horsepower is just one way we have of measuring the work that machines are doing for us. I love this observation from one historian who was looking at this. He said in modern life, in the city, there are only two kinds of animals. There are pets and there are pests. Either ones we love or ones that we're trying to get out of the environment. So my research on this topic explores how that bond between humans and animals changed in the 19th century. There was a time when many of the moral quandaries that we face today about the treatment of animals was first raised and debated in the United States. What does it mean to suggest that animals have any sort of rights? What's the link between cruelty to animals and cruelty to human beings? Where's the boundary between acceptable use and the immoral exploitation of the way we use animals? In medical testing, in the production of our protein, for entertainment, our moral calculus about these matters changed in the 19th century, and it continues to evolve. But we always balance animal welfare with our own welfare. And we'll see that the Erie Canal was an interesting test case for that attempt to balance human interest and the interest of animals. Place to start in that story, I think, is this man, Henry Bergh, who played a crucial role in provoking those debates a century and a half ago as the most visible champion for the concerns of animals. In 1866, he founded New York's ASPCA, which was the nation's first animal welfare society. Bergh was himself a fascinating character. Some called him the riddle of the 19th century. One part of that riddle was that he came to that interest in animals quite late in his life. He was at the age of 53 that he started to get involved in the ASPCA. Before that point, he had inherited his wealth. His father was a rope maker and shipbuilder in Manhattan. He'd inherited that wealth, spent a couple of years studying law at Columbia, dropped out, and spent most of his time in Europe with his socialite wife, attending the opera and the theater. He loved the theater, and he tried to become a playwright, and he wrote some really god-awful plays, bad verse, and was unable to get this published. Another part of that riddle is that up to this point, he didn't seem to particularly care about animals. He didn't own any pets. He was said to dislike dogs, but he thought that cruelty was barbaric. So it was really not so much that he loved animals as that he hated cruelty. During the Civil War, Lincoln, because he was a cosmopolitan figure, Bergh got invited to be part of the embassy in Russia. So he's in St. Petersburg, and he sees a teamster beating his horse, and he demands that the teamster stop. And I think because he was wearing his epaulets of an ambassador and his fancy pants, the teamster drops the whip. Bergh says, that was the best thing I've ever done in my life. That was the first time I've done something I'm sure was really, really useful. So he describes later on that this was a sort of a conversion moment for him. He returns to the US. He didn't stay in Russia long. He stops in Britain to visit with the founders of the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which had been formed in the 1820s. It's an interesting link between the anti-slavery movement that developed in England and the anti-cruelty movement of protection of animals. People like William Wilberforce were involved in both of these causes. So Bergh learns what he can about that. And then he comes back to the United States. And in 1866, the year after the Civil War, he throws himself into this crusade. Thanks to his energetic lobbying and his influential friends, New York passes the first anti-cruelty law in the country. It became a crime under this law to, quote, maliciously kill, maim, wound, injure, torture, or cruelly beat any horse, mule, cow, cattle, sheep, or other animal. Many other states across the North and the Midwest especially followed Bergh's lead, and over the next 2 decades adopted pretty much the same language for their own anti-cruelty legislation. The most controversial and in some ways the most important part of this new anti-cruelty law was the provision that allowed the SPCAs to hire their own special agents. These were badge-wearing deputies who roamed the city streets, made surprise inspections, and even made arrests sometimes recruiting the police and sometimes just trying to do that themselves, issuing fines or taking people to court who were seen to be cruel to their animals. Thanks to this new police power that Bergh and his deputies now had, Bergh became a familiar figure on the streets of New York and also in the nation's newspapers. He was 6 feet tall, usually wore an elegant top hat and a silver cane, long drooping mustache. He would plant himself on the city streets along the horse railroad lines and arrest any driver that he found that was working sick or lame horses. When he did this, passengers had to get off the trolley. Traffic backed up. Hundreds of people gathered to watch what was really a strange spectacle at the time. The justice system, for the first time, defending the rights of animals over the convenience of human beings. It's a story that the newspapers could not resist telling, and the whole country came to follow Bergh's confrontations on the streets of New York. They loved to report on what they called the latest Berghism, the latest outrage that he was trying to propose. One of the main sources of animal abuse, as he saw it, was overloading. Horse-drawn trolleys became an essential part of the infrastructure of late 19th century cities. They carried millions of passengers over the course of a year, and the suburbs, the expansion of cities that happened in the late 19th century was really made possible by the fact that there were these horse trolleys running on rails that would carry suburbanites into the city center. In order to maximize their profit, the trolley companies put no limit at all on the number of passengers who could pile onto these trolleys. And the result was that these horses running these trolleys lived short, painful lives. And this was rationalized cruelty. These owners of these trolley lines very carefully understood how much protein, how much energy they needed to put into these horses, how much stabling before they would wear them out. And it would often be, these horses were rarely sent off to a green pasture to enjoy a retirement, but rather they were sent to the glue factory after 2 or 3 years, fairly broken. So in the streets of New York, the horse car lines fought back at first, protesting that Bergh was interfering with their property rights and their profits, and also the convenience of millions of commuters. But Bergh held his ground. When Teamsters ignored his warnings or tried to challenge his right to arrest them, he was known to grab them by the collars and throw them to the street. And he spent long hours trying to prosecute offenders of the law. In 1876, a decade into the evolution of this crusade, Bergh and his agents turned their attention to the plight of horses and mules on the canal. So I'd like to read a few pages from my book that really deal specifically with the experience of these horses and mules. Since opening in 1825, the Erie Canal provided a vital commercial highway for a large swath of the country, linking the expanding farms of the upper Midwest with the urban populations of the East and transforming New York into the nation's busiest port. Often praised as a great feat of human engineering, the canal ultimately relied on the muscle of humble horses and mules that pulled these barges. Until ice closed the canal each winter, thousands of teams moved millions of tons of flour, lumber, and other bulky produce to market every year. From Buffalo to Albany, returning to the interior with a load of the city's manufactured goods. Over the 7-month shipping season, a horse might make the 700-mile round trip from Buffalo to Albany 5 times, towing barges that could weigh 50 tons or more. In the city, trolley horses slipped and snapped under the strain of tremendous loads, while rich men's steeds shivered in the cold and were made to prance unnaturally with bit burrs and check reins. For the animals consigned to life on the Erie Canal towpath, the suffering was different. Pulling heavy barges through the water placed steady, unrelenting pressure on the animals' shoulders, producing a chafing that often rubbed their sweaty flesh into open sores. In the mid-1870s, Bergh called on humane agents along the canal route to prosecute anyone caught driving galled horses and mules. The society's interference with horse railroads had sometimes paralyzed traffic on a major city boulevard for a few hours. Resting business as usual on the Erie Canal threatened much more. A major portion of the shipping essential to the state and the national economy rested on the sore shoulders of these animals, and Bergh aimed to help them cost what it may. And so, as a veteran boatman warned, quote, "The commerce of our state is in great danger." Once again, Bergh provoked an uncomfortable debate about the proper balance between animal rights and human interests, and the animal suffering at the core of the American economy. Newspapers, suddenly interested in the health of the canal's horses, offered their readers diametrically opposed views of what their lives were like. Bergh and his agents described them as the most pathetic of silent slaves. There was not a sound animal to be found along the entire canal route, Bergh claimed. Quote, "Nowhere else in the state are horses so inhumanly and wickedly treated." Often cast-offs from the urban trolley system, they spent their last days toiling on the towpath, cringing in pain from galls, open sores that often festered under the harness. As an agent in Rochester pleaded, "If you will go with me for one day, I will show you wounds, bruises, and putrefying sores that will make you shudder and grow sick at heart." And these cruelties have been perpetrated and continued summer after summer for many years. When used up, the animals were sometimes abandoned to starve, and dead animals along the canal path were a common sight. Towpath drivers found this dark portrait much exaggerated. Poor or cruel masters there might be, but most understood how to care for their horses, a professional responsibility for men who made their living in partnership with these animals. In addition to long months of winter at ease in the barn, canal horses enjoyed regular periods of rest while on the towpath. 2 pairs pulled a canal barge, each team working for 6 hours, then riding in the bow while the other team toiled. Teamwork that allowed the barges to move ahead 24 hours a day. Still, the canal drivers could not deny that despite these regular periods of rest, canal horses developed painful galls on their shoulders, injuries that they could minimize but could not prevent. As one veteran canal man summed it up when Bergh tried to ban the use of galled horses, he was, quote, "trying to force men to do something that they have not the power to accomplish." Declaring no act of cruelty more atrocious, in 1876, Bergh ordered his agent in Syracuse to arrest anyone found working galled horses. "You will be called hard names and even be threatened," he predicted, "but threatened men live long and in the end are victorious. For want of a better example, I offer myself." Bergh's agents in Troy, Utica, and other towns along the route began to confront the drivers, disrupting canal traffic by detaining and fining the worst cases of sore and lame horses. In his anxiety to spare the tow horses, the New York Post complained, Bergh was now inflicting severe suffering on the canal workers and their families. The boatmen's neighbors agreed, and the SPCA agents found it hard to win a jury conviction in a canal town. Much worse, by protecting the canal horses, the anti-cruelty movement was pinching an essential artery of American trade. "The animals have to stand the galls," the boatmen insisted. "There's not any help for it." Mules and horses must be sacrificed for men. Another friend of the shipping interests put the problem much more baldly. Bergh must accept that, quote, the prosperity of the canals depends upon torturing horses. Because no harness system seemed able to relieve the unrelenting pressure that pulling a heavy barge through the water, Bergh proposed reducing the number of hours that the animals labored each day. In addition to their commercial load, the barges already carried a second team and feed for the two pairs. Adding a third team with two pairs resting would reduce the number of hours and pressure on each animal's shoulders. But the change would be costly. Barges would have to be larger or carry smaller loads, and the added expense of owning and feeding the additional horses threatened to drive up the price of shipping, significantly making the whole business unsustainable. A Buffalo newspaper estimated that Bergh's crusade would cost the canal interests $3 million a year and significantly raise the price of grain for everyone else. Bergh countered with the unwelcome suggestion that if painful shoulder galls were inevitable, perhaps the canal should be filled with dirt and turned into a railroad bed. The nation's enthusiasm for canal building had ended several decades prior, in large part because of the advantages of the fast-growing railroad network. Just like the managers of urban trolley lines, the canal shippers were even then experimenting with ways to modernize by replacing their horses with steam engines. But even at the plodding 4-mile-per-hour pace of the horse-drawn barges, the Erie Canal remained economically vital in the 1870s, the least expensive way to bring much of the Upper Midwest's massive harvest to urban markets. In the midst of this controversy, Bergh headed to Albany, pressing the legislature for additional powers. He wanted a new law to stop trolley companies from salting the streets and to punish anyone who left metal or glass in the roadway, trash that maimed horses. Though lawmakers supported this measure, a growing number of influential newspaper editors concluded that Henry Bergh had pushed things too far on too many fronts, becoming a thorough nuisance who had to be reined in. They called on the legislature to restrict his powers, not expand them. Unchecked, Bergh threatened to destroy the livelihood of 25,000 men who worked the canal and to, quote, sacrifice the trade of a port to protect the skin of a mule. Hollow pretense and professions of humanity have carried Mr. Bergh a good way, another editor grumbled, but he appears to be rapidly approaching the end of his public career. But by 1876, public support for the SPCA movement and Bergh's leadership in that cause were too well established to be attacked head on. Instead, the canal interest asked Albany lawmakers for a special exemption from this Bergh Act for their horses. An indignant Bergh declared that this is one of the most extraordinary bills ever introduced into any legislative body. He was good at the sorts of exaggeration. This time, Bergh prevailed. After giving lengthy testimony in Albany, he managed to fend off the canal shippers' challenge to the ASPCA's authority. In the years ahead, his agents would continue to pressure the boatmen on the Erie Canal and would continue to insist that galls were a price that horses would have to pay in order for humans to prosper. As with horse trolleys, Bergh recognized that the problem would only be resolved when machines replaced animals. The antiquated system of freight transportation, he said, must be substituted by some motor more in keeping with the spirit of the age. As we hear, many people ridicule Bergh for being a misguided animal lover. They said he had an absurd tenderness toward creatures and no concern for the well-being of his fellow human beings. But love him or hate him, the American public was fascinated by Bergh, a man who seemed to love animals more than human beings. While Bergh was the center of this reform movement, thousands of men and women across the country joined in these decades, forming their own SPCAs in states across the country and putting their own agents into the city streets in order to arrest those that they called cruelists. The symbol of the ASPCA was an angel of mercy rescuing a horse from his bestial master's cruel beating. But the agents took on much more than horsewhipping and the abuse of Erie Canal mules. They installed public drinking troughs in cities, and they lobbied for improved pavements. Many of the pavements were too slippery and horses were breaking their ankles all the time. They organized to stop railroads from shipping livestock in terrible conditions. There were no regulations to control the way livestock was shipped at that point. So cattle, pigs, sheep were all crammed into the same cars where they might spend many days without food and water, battling each other for space. And in the shipping business, it was assumed that at least 20% of the animals put into these cars would be dead by the time they arrived at their destination. So the SPCA movement organized across the country to push for the first federal animal welfare law that required railroads to provide food, water, and rest for these animals every 28 hours. When Bergh lobbied and cajoled for more humane slaughtering practices, he argued that the animals that experienced the terror and the physical suffering during the slaughtering process would only produce tainted and poisoned meat. That cruelty was not only immoral, but it was also unhealthy for consumers. In this way, the ASPCA became a consumer movement, the first to be promoting what we now call cruelty-free products. Bergh even invented a horse ambulance, introduced in New York even before human ambulances were created. I mentioned that one of the most important aspects of the anti-cruelty law was the creation of these badge-wearing agents of enforcement. The other was this: Bergh offered protection from cruelty not just to horses and cattle. Even Bergh's critics tended to applaud that goal. They could see the abuse of horses. If they weren't their own horses, they could support that idea, so long as their own personal interests were not threatened. But Bergh used that law to extend protection to all creatures. And that included large packs of stray dogs that roamed the city streets during the Gilded Age. Fearing rabies, American cities announced a war on these dogs many summers and paid a 50-cent bounty for stray dogs, dead or alive. Immigrants and homeless children would terrorize the dogs and everyone else with their rage on large packs of stray dogs, and oftentimes kidnap people's pets in order to get the 50-cent bounty. These live dogs would be dragged to a central location at the docks and either drowned or clubbed to death en masse by the thousands over the course of the summer. The women of the SPCA in Philadelphia responded to this horrific practice by inventing the first animal shelter in the United States. They replaced this bounty system with the use for the first time of professional dog catchers who used humane treatment in trying to capture the animals. And they also used the shelters in order to try not just to kill these animals, but to try to find their owners and return them. And they even pioneered, the Quaker ladies of Philadelphia pioneered the first gas chambers as a way to euthanize strays that was more humane than dispatching them with a club or a knife. Henry Bergh also went after P.T. Barnum, the great entertainer, for mistreatment of animals in his museums and the circus. And the SPCA launched a campaign against vivisection, medical experimentation that continues down to today. And he went after the notorious Kit Burns, the city's best-known promoter of dog fights and rat fights. And Bergh had a sensational arrest of Burns, who had a saloon that was carefully guarded so that police could not break in. It's a huge crowds for these, and he was trying to stamp this out. He finally had to break through with the police on a skylight above the dogfight and lower himself down in the middle of the dogfight in order to capture and arrest Kit Burns. Bergh, who was clearly an aristocrat and never failed to appear impeccably dressed while on his rounds through these dark places, was criticized at times for picking on poor immigrants and working people like Burns who were just enjoying themselves with a popular pastime. But Bergh denied that he was only going after the poor with his reform. And we can see that in his long-running battle with pigeon shooters. This was a popular pastime for wealthy men, shooting thousands of pigeons, often passenger pigeons that were rounded up by the thousands and released one at a time to be shot in target contests. Proponents said it was harmless, that Bergh didn't understand the manly practice of shooting guns, and that pigeon shooters were getting good practice for American men who might one day have to use their rifle skills to fend off an invader. Bergh called them genteel ruffians, and he made this argument many times. the pain and the suffering inflicted on these pigeons and on these other animals that he's interested in was not only a terrible assault on God's creatures, but it also made human beings more cruel. This is an argument that I think he adopted from the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement. Those who enjoyed a dogfight or a pigeon shoot or a rat baiting contest left that experience a little less human, a bit more likely to be cruel, not only to animals again, but also to other people. It coarsened the soul. And so he was fighting cruelty with that sort of argument in mind. Cultivating kindness, especially among children, was an important part of this movement, what came to be called humane education. The SPCA's developed thousands of newsletters and pamphlets. Most important was their publication in the United States of the British novel Black Beauty, written by a supporter of the SPCA movement in England, Anna Sewell. And they created these bands of mercy for young people to get them together to talk about the importance of being kind to animals. The most optimistic reformers in this period believed that it's too late to change the minds of adults whose ideas about animals had hardened, but if you could reach children, the rising generation, if they could learn to be kind to animals, this would ultimately remove cruelty in all its forms and usher in an era of world peace. Henry Bergh took a darker view of human nature. He believed that the threat of punishment was really the only way to stop cruel men. And he actually proposed that anyone found guilty of cruelty to animals or to children or to beating their wives should be publicly flogged. He also argued that flogging should be done by a steam-powered flogging machine that somebody should develop so that the whipper would not show any mercy. Everybody would get an equal amount of pain inflicted on them for the pain that they were inflicting on others. Even Bergh's allies thought he was losing his perspective when he made this proposal for a steam-powered whipping machine. And many of his critics proved once again that this proved he was not an animal lover, but a humanity hater. But when Bergh died in 1888, even his critics begrudgingly praised him for his devotion to the cause. Over the course of 2 decades, his movement raised public awareness about cruelty. It no longer seemed an inevitable feature of life in American cities, but instead a social problem that could be overcome. We take the SPCA for granted now, along with the dozens of other organizations that lobby and protect animals. But we should not forget how controversial this idea was not so long ago. The movement worked to make visible the many horrors of animal abuse in American cities, but there was also an optimism to this movement that was typical of many 19th century reforms, belief that progress was possible, that something as fundamental to human civilization as its use of animals could improve from barbarism to civilization, as Bergh would call it. That cruelty was not hardwired into human nature, but could be removed through education or at least stifled through the threat of punishment. So those working to advance animal rights and animal welfare today can acknowledge the value of Bergh's work and of these thousands of men and women who joined in this cause. But they also need to note its limitations. Bergh insisted that animals had a right only to not experience unnecessary cruelty. Not that animals could not be used, but they had to be used in such a way that didn't unnecessarily inflict pain on them. So his version of animal rights is actually quite mild compared to many of those who are advocating for full animal rights today. He also missed out, I think, or did not see at the time what we now think of as the insights of the environmental movement. The case of turtles is a good example. Bergh and his allies protested the treatment of turtles as they arrived from Florida into the Fulton Fish Market. They were gathered into the holds of ships, flipped upside down, ropes run through their flippers so that they would not flop around too much. And then they were sold off to saloon owners who would tend to put them in front of their saloon with a sign on their belly saying "Soup on Friday," and they would be exposed to all the dust and scuffling of the city streets until that point. Bergh tried to arrest ship owners who were shipping the turtles this way. He waged a 20-year court case trying to improve their treatment and failed. The judges felt concerned about the rights of turtles, was just going one thing too far. And there was actually interesting arguments to suggest that turtles don't feel anything at all. Why protect turtles? But Bergh tried and failed to protect these turtles. But what he didn't realize at the time was the turtle population in the Caribbean was being systematically destroyed by harvesting at the time. Because this was an urban movement, the sort of problems of animal welfare beyond the city was invisible to him. Another obvious example of this was that this was the same period when the great buffalo herds were being destroyed in the West. Some military officers wrote to Bergh, described the horrendous killing, destruction, waste of these buffalo herds. Bergh clearly sympathized, but he said, "There's nothing I can do. I only operate within the confines of New York City and of New York state law. So what's happening on the plains of Kansas is beyond my range." So my point is to conclude that Bergh's movement was profoundly important for forcing Americans to grapple with their treatment of animals. And he showed how to build a movement and to mobilize public opinion and the courts in order to work on behalf of animals in ways that shocked and fascinated his contemporaries in late 19th century America. But in other ways, this movement really just launched a set of moral questions that we're still grappling with today. Thank you very much. There are questions or yes?
Yes, terrific. Very good, thank you.
Sure.
I know contemporaneously Peter Singer read so much about this. Yeah.
Right.
Talk about it a little bit.
Well, I mean, he would be a person who would suggest that Bergh's, it's a good start, but not nearly strong enough, right? That's the dividing line between animal welfare and a sort of strong case of animal rights. So Peter Singer's Australian philosopher who really founded the modern animal rights movement and basically is arguing that animals should be granted the same status under law and morality as any other being, and that until we get to that point, we're really not free of this dilemma. So, yeah, yes.
You get involved, say how we're interested.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time with my previous books. I wrote a book about the impact of electric light on American life in this period. I spent a lot of time thinking about kind of what the city looked like at that point. And anytime you look at a picture of the city from this period, animals everywhere, horses especially. So I just struck by reading Peter Singer and some others, realizing that it was one of those really profound transitions that happened over the course of 50 years. Where one of the things I found interesting about this case is that in a lot of situations, Bergh was, for example, very concerned about the abuse of livestock, and it was quite visible. If you lived in Syracuse in the 1870s and 80s, especially in the poorer neighborhoods, there would be stockyards and there would be butchers, and there'd be slaughterhouses, and all the stink and the destruction that entailed. And Bergh worked against that, but basically what that did was essentially remove it from our view, right? The solution was to put it all in Chicago, sort of behind out of sight, right? So I think I'm interested in kind of the way these moral dilemmas that we face today were grappled with initially in this period. I also at the time ran into a story that I didn't mention here, but I think is so interesting, and I included in the book, and I think it probably sparked my interest in this topic. In 1872, there was a flu that broke out in Canada, in Toronto, and it jumped over into the United States very quickly. It was a flu that only affected horses and mules, and if they were about 95% of the horses and mules that got sick would be unable to work. A very high percentage of them died. It was an energy crisis, and I think There's another situation where the Erie Canal was suddenly shut down in its crucial period of harvest because the mules were too sick. And as it turned out, I just found that really interesting. Made you realize just, it was essentially shut down the entire economy. It took about a year for this flu to move across the country and finally burned itself out a year later in Nicaragua. But everywhere it went for a month or so, it was like, what happened? What happens if you pull horses and mules out of the economy for a month? And it was total devastation. People had to haul their own milk wagons, and cities closed down because at the rail depots because there was so much stuff backed up. So I just found that really kind of got me interested in thinking about this topic. And then Bergh is such a weird guy and irresistible to write about. Admirable but eccentric, like many reformers. Yeah.
That relates to the question that comes was how did you first come across Bergh side of him early?
I think it was really, it was following that story of the 1872, because he was right in the streets of New York, insisting that horses and mules be sent back to the barn. People were desperate to work their horses. The entire economy depended on this. Poor people who, they might only have a horse to make their living, right? Hauling refuse or selling strawberries or whatever it might be. If your horse had this illness and you forced it to work, it would develop a terrible secondary sort of syndrome that would cause it to die a very, very painful death. Its legs would inflate with fluid. And just horrendous. So Bergh was trying to stop that from happening by being out in the streets, identifying sick horses, and insisting that they go back to the barn. And again, Bergh faced this dilemma where people were saying, being nice to the horses is all well and good, but when it really pinches on human interest, humans win. Right? And Bergh took on people like Vanderbilt, who owned the most powerful monopoly on horse trolleys in Manhattan. Yeah.
And we get the impression, and I don't know if it went straight, that the populace in general would value horses more than mules aesthetically in races that were coming on and all of that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
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 So did he extend, or did the sentiment grow toward respecting mules as much too, or is it kind of horses were special, mules were okay, you gotta take care of that?
I didn't see that at all with Bergh. I think again, he was concerned about lobsters and turtles, and so he didn't make that distinction. He spent a lot of time going after rich men who did all sorts of things to their horses in order to get them to they had fancy, I mentioned a little bit in this passage, so bit burrs that would cause pain in there, but make them look like they were lively, energetic animals. And Bergh went off after them. Again, he insisted, while many of these abuses were caused by people who were poor, and very often judges refused to actually punish poor people who were working their horses too much or so forth, because for them, it was their livelihood. But Bergh went after the wealthy just as much. And I think in some ways he was empowered to do that because he was himself part of New York's wealthy elite. So he kind of knew those people and felt fully entitled to write Vanderbilt a letter announcing him for what he was doing to his horses.
But he'd gone after the 6 hours on, 6 hour off kind of schedule on the biography.
Would he have supported that?
Yeah.
I think he proposed it, but
Yeah.
I think he wasn't concerned about the practicalities of that.
Right.
Although I was fascinated to learn that the Erie Canal here had become a railroad bed, just as Bergh, at the time when Bergh suggested this, of course, that was considered to be an outrage, but turned out to be prophetic.
Do you know anything about his religious background?
He was just vaguely Anglican. I mean, very, very minimal. religious commitment on this part. Other leaders, the Quaker ladies of Philadelphia, for example, clearly had a religious motivation woven into this. In a lot of ways, this movement it inherits a lot of the moral language and strategies for promoting their ideas from the anti-slavery movement. So obviously, there was a lot of Christian influence in that. The founder of the SPCA in Boston was also much more explicitly a Christian. Bergh was, I saw very little. If it had been there, I would have been very interested in it, but I never saw him. He tended, he used the Bible very selectively in order to justify his cause, but it was not something that was a personal significance to him, as far as I could tell. Yeah.
So you mentioned SPCA agents in most major canal cities. I'm wondering, so we found the SPCA in 1866, right? But how quickly does this spread across, like New York and the country? Like, is this something where people are like, oh, finally someone's saying something about this, or it takes time?
It was so fascinating. Bergh was the person we identify with this movement because New York was so central, of course, but also because he was the most provocative. But when he started to do this in 1866, almost simultaneously, George Angel in Boston and the women of Philadelphia were right on top of that at the same time. So these things happened almost simultaneously in 1866 and 1867. And then the sort of the spread of these chapters into cities like Syracuse and West across, much less so in the South. Of course, the South is recovering from the Civil War at this point and is much more rural. This is largely an urban movement, right? But it's really develops right across the North within a decade. Just about, I think, 20 states had significant laws and significant chapters. Well, we're still very spotty, of course, in terms of the ability to actually enforce this and to win significant legal cases. In that sense, Bergh was, when he went after turtles, for example, he knew that was going to be outrageous. And he actually admits this at a certain point. He says, the worst thing that can happen is nobody knows what we're doing. So if I push the envelope on this topic and get into the newspapers, even if people are ridiculing me, they're going to at least know what we stand for. Right? So Bergh was much more willing and able to be ridiculed. He was very sensitive. He could talk about, he couldn't resist provoking these issues and taking it to court and using this very, very dramatic language. He really, he was a terrible playwright, but he was very, very effectively dramatic on the streets of New York. But he would say he would go home and cry in his pillow, and feel terrible about the kind of we see the cartoons of him and sort of the sense that he's a misanthropic character. He took that surprisingly personally, he kept pushing on. He was in his mid-70s. He died. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm curious, we often think of this failure of empathy, whether it be for animals or during the issue of slavery as well, as a moral deficiency. But certainly empathy is a biological function. It's something that we're taught. There's intellectual aspects to failure to see the pain and suffering in front of you. Now, you had mentioned targeting children and raising children to think better and to do better.
Mm-hmm.
Did that work seem to have a strong influence in improving the situation?
Yeah, that's, it's really hard to answer that question in a way. In the 19th century, American families, middle-class families, this began to say families should have pets. Right, the whole, pet shop culture is something which I talk about in the book, that, and dog shows and the interest in fancy breeds and that sort of thing. And this emerges out of a similar sense of we need to train children to love an animal or animals, right? I'd like to say it paid off, but I mean, it's a little hard to measure the impact of that. One thing that's happening in this period, as I'm suggesting, is that our whole relationship to animals, for many other reasons, is shifting. And animals are sort of, yes, we love our pets and we hate our pests, but the rest of our engagement with animals is sort of invisible to us, right? It's we encounter cattle mostly wrapped in plastic and styrofoam at the grocery store counter rather than in person. Buckets of fried chicken. So, in some ways, I think that, that's part of what made, I think, this an interesting urban experience, is because I think you could not see the treatment of animals in these urban environments, right? It was there, and in some ways for us, it's much harder to see at this point. But I do think we have it. I think Bergh's right. I think this movement was right. I think we probably do have much more sensitivity to cruelty. Plenty of blind spots, but I think that. Well, what do you all think?
Better than it was.
I think so.
What's that?
It's better than it used to be.
Yeah.
I mean, this book is a horrendous catalog of bad behavior. Yeah, I tried to explain to the publisher why it would be a good idea for animal lovers to read a book that was full of people clobbering their horse with a rock, and it's a little boat. Yes.
What I accept analysis of this downfront economy, people are more likely to abandon their animals. I live along the river, and I can't tell you how many kittens I have had to save. Because people think they're gonna drop them, but then they can't, so they just leave them.
Yeah.
And then the dogs that were abandoned, earlier this week. A few years ago, someone left 2 dogs in a crate at the cemetery. My daughter fostered those dogs, but I don't know that it's a lot better, but I think people still have a lot of people to that. So I think, especially when the economies like this, they can't work for themselves, they're most likely to also build a community with them also.
Yeah.
And there was something on the news was last night about this new grant here. The house shelter.
Yeah.
Governor Hochul just signed another $10 million to put to the animal shelter here because we're so deficient.
They're overrun. I volunteered for from friends of Campbell, so that's right again. Get calls all the time about the Dutch animals.
Yeah.
Not just dogs and cats, I mean, there a goat was found in that, this a few months ago that had been dumped.
Yeah.
Rabbits, birds, just like to stop them.
On the other hand, there is now an infrastructure of people like you responding to these, which is sort of
But it's overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Especially since the city doesn't really have a shelter. They've been farming them out to these, private shelters to take care of animals. And it's expensive.
That's interesting because I taught in Tennessee for a couple decades, and I was always struck. And I live in Maine most of the time, and I was struck by I sort of got fascinated while I was writing this book at looking at animals up for adoption on Craigslist in Tennessee, and there were enormous numbers always of them, right?
Well, those animals on Craigslist, I mean, use for the various activities as bait.
Yeah.
For dog fights or just abuse in general.
Yeah.
So
right.
we discourage people from purchasing or taking animals off Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace because before putting that on, I found kids and it's like, oh, just put it on Craigslist, and I got That just gives to be used for bait. I've seen them.
Yeah.
So, no.
Part of my research brought me to the Massachusetts SPCA. They had a wonderful archive that in Boston. Part of it had been straight burned down by the custodian in the building. He wanted to prove that he was a good firefighter, and so he set fire. So I love some of it was not there, but I found a lot of interesting things there. And at a certain point, the woman who was running the archive said, "Would you like to see our state-of-the-art facility for adopted animals?" And of course, I was interested. So I looked out, and there was a huge, beautiful facility, and there were about 2 dogs there. She said, "They're in such demand in the Boston area that." And I often felt like driving back from Tennessee, I should just fill up the back of my pickup truck with coon dogs and bring them north because there's so many people in Maine who want it.
Lots of transports that come. There's
Yeah.
Mississippi, so it's all wrong.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
different cultural
yeah.
approach to this. Although I get your point that it's not like it's all better here in the north.
I wouldn't mean it as a moral judgment at all, but Bolivia and Venezuela and traveled a number of times to Central America, and living barrios there, the treatment of animals is different. The whole sense of pets, the whole sense of dogs and cats, everything, as well as in the rural areas. Like again, it's complex. It's definitely a lot of different questions at times. There's diverse. Again, I'm not making a judgment about treatment, some of which I certainly would like to approve of.
Right.
But it's really just different. And put that all in perspective.
Yeah.
There's cultural issues involved that I think that we just touched a little bit. Used to be difficult sometimes for North Americans to figure out.
I was in the Caribbean once and went on an interesting tour of a farm, and a bunch of us standing around and getting talking to the farmer, and there was a cat there, and somebody was petting the cat and said, "What's the cat's name?" And the farmer said, "Cat." But the idea of it taking ownership, that giving it a name, this was just not part of the culture. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the conversation.